Шулювання, кажеш. Шулювання. Хлюбатом, знаєш? Піци хлюбатом, знаєш? Нормально. Турно. Нет, на себя-то посмотри уже. Поешь ужасно ты, да. Поешь ужасно ты, да. Ну, да. Смеется, ты, то есть как бы, то есть реально что ли, ты знаешь что ли?
There are two things about games that I firmly believe. One, designers should be able to impose a singular vision on the player if they so wish. So Dark Souls only
Мегагрупп предлагает готовый сайт-бизнес для продвижения ваших услуг в интернете. Готовый сайт выгоден.
Hi everyone. I spend a lot of time mashing away at a keyboard trying to tell the computer what to do. Even my oddly shaped computer that constantly gets teased for looking like a trash can is unbelievably good at following instructions. Unfortunately, I'm not so good at giving them, so the results are inevitably a little wonky. But nevertheless, it's always been such a mysterious thing to me that this inanimate lump of metal and sand and whatever else, arranged in some extremely clever way, is able to do maths and logic and remember things, and ultimately allows us to create pretty much anything we set our minds to. It's kind of bizarre. And I'd really like to understand better how it works. So here's a little circuit with a light and two switches, A and B, and clearly the light can only go on if I close both of these switches. Already this is a kind of simple logic. We're testing if two conditions are true, switch A is closed and switch B is closed. If we represent an open switch with a 0 and a closed switch with a 1, these are the different configurations we could have. And here's the output. 0 meaning the light would be off, and 1 meaning it would be on. Since that's only the case when A and B are 1, this is known as the logical AND operation. And this kind of table, by the way, is called a truth table. Here's a bit of a different circuit. This time we only have one switch, and even though it's open, the light is currently on. If I close the switch, now the light will go off, because we've created an easier path for the current to travel. So we're essentially inverting the input. If the state of the switch is 0, the output is 1, and vice versa. And this is known as if the state of the switch is the current to travel. So the light will go off, because we've created an easier path for the current to travel. So we're essentially inverting the input. If the state of the switch is 0, the output is 1, and vice versa. And this is known as the logical NOT operation. Now, I've been controlling these switches with my fingers, which computers sadly lack. So in the very early days, electromagnets were used to open and close the switches, but this was kind of clunky and slow, so then came fancier technologies like vacuum tubes, and finally transistors. As a tiny example of what transistors do, this is essentially that same notch thing from before, just set up on a breadboard and with a transistor in the place of the paperclip switch. If we think of the current flowing in this circuit, it would look something like this. It can't flow through the transistor at the moment because right now it's acting as an open switch. But if we send power to the middle pin of the transistor, establishing a small flow of current like this, the fancy physics of the transistor will make it act like a closed switch instead, allowing the main current to flow through it like so. Just like before, the light is turned off because we've created a much easier path for the current to take. So essentially the transistor is a switch which we can open and close with electricity instead of our fingers. I'd love to one day try and build a simple computer out of components like this, which is what Ben Eater has done in his very cool 8-bit breadboard computer series. But that's a little intimidating for me at the moment, so instead I've made a simplified and abstracted little simulation where we have our two logical building blocks and not, and we can play around and try to figure some stuff out. So on the left here are some inputs which can be turned on and off, or we can also think of it as true and false, or 1 and 0, it doesn't really matter. But I'll wire these up to the inputs of the AND gate, and if you recall my sophisticated circuitry from earlier, the two inputs simply control whether these switches are open or closed, which should be achieved using transistors, not paper clips, of course. Now I'll connect the result of this AND gate up to my output node over here, and so this will only light up if both inputs are on. Let's get the NOT gate participating as well, so I'll connect it up over here and wire the result of that to the output instead. So the output is now inverted. It's off when both inputs are on, but in all other cases it's on. Here's a truth table for this thing we've just built, and it actually has a name. This is the NOT AND, or rather NAND gate. If I click on the Create button down here, it'll package that up into its own little chip, and we now have a NAND gate to mess about with. I guess this is a good moment to mention NAND to Tetris, which, along with Ben's videos, is a fantastic free resource that I've been using to learn more about this stuff, so I recommend checking that out if you're interested. Anyway, to take this a little further, we could maybe try inverting both of the inputs before feeding them into the NAND gate, and let's see what that does. So with both inputs off, the output is off. If I turn either of them on, the output goes on, and if both are on, the output is still on. So we've created what's called an OR gate, and I'll turn that into its own little chip as well, because it seems pretty useful. And here's the truth table for that. Alright, let's take a moment to think about something that's pretty important to compute. Numbers. In the decimal system that we know and love, there are 10 digits, 0 through 9. And if we want to go higher than that, we need to add another place to the left, where each digit actually represents 10 times as much as those in the previous spot. And we can have as many places as we need, so here would be hundreds and thousands and so on. In the realm of electronics, though, it's easier to work with just 2 digits, because they can be naturally represented with a low voltage or a high voltage. So this binary system works in the exact same way as the decimal system. It's just that once we reach 1, we've already run out of digits, and so we increment the place to the left. Because there are only 2 digits in binary, each place is worth 2 times more than the last. So if the first place is worth 1, then this place is worth 2, then 4, then 8, and so on. So let's say we want to figure out what this sequence 1101 would be in decimal. Well, we can write it out as 8 times 1 plus 4 times 1 plus 2 times 0 plus 1 times 1, and that comes out to 13. Alright, now what I'd like to do is design something that's able to add 2 binary numbers together. So let's work through a quick example by hand. Say we want to add these 2 together. Starting on the right here, 1 plus 1 is 2, which in binary is 1, 0. So I'll write the 0 down here, and then carry the 1 over up here, because we'll need to add it together with these other 2 in order to figure out what goes in this spot. By the way, this part that we wrote down here straight away I'll refer to as the sum bit, and this one up here is the carry bit. Okay, let's continue. 1 plus 1 is 2, plus the carry gives us 3 in decimal, or 1, 1 in binary. So I'll write 1 over here, that's the sum bit, and carry the other 1 over to the left. Now we have 0 plus 1, plus the carry bit is 2 again, so put 0 down here, and 1 up here. This will just give us 1, so I'll write that down here. Then 0 plus 0 is 0, and finally 1 plus 0 is 1. In case you care to know, what we've just calculated here is 35 plus 7. It's a little daunting to try start thinking about how we can wire our logic gates together to do all of this. So let's start small with adding together just 2 single bits. For example, if we're adding a 0 and a 0 together, then naturally both the carry bit and the sum bit will be 0. But if the first bit is a 0 and the second is 1, or the other way around, then the carry bit will be 0 and the sum bit will be 1. Finally, if both bits are 1, then the carry will be 1 and the sum bit will be 0. So if we look at the carry column here, it might look familiar because it's actually an exact match with the AND operation. The sum column, on the other hand, doesn't match exactly with anything we've already seen, but it's quite close to the OR gate we created earlier. It just has a 0 in this last spot instead of a 1. So let's take that OR gate as a starting point, and we just need to turn the output to a 0 when both inputs are 1. So I'm going to take a NAND gate and connect it up here. And this will check if both inputs are 1, and then invert the results, so it's outputting 0 in that case. We can then use an AND gate to check if either of the inputs is 1, but not both of them. Let's test this quickly. With both inputs off, or 0, the output is 0. With just a single input set to 1, the output is 1, but crucially, when both inputs are 1, the output will be 0 again. This operation has a special name as well. It's called an exclusive OR, XOR for short. Okay, so I now have an empty chip with 2 inputs which we want to add together, and 2 outputs, the sum bit and the carry bit. So we can use our new XOR gate to calculate the sum bit of the 2 inputs, and then remember that only if both inputs are 1 should the carry bit be 1, and so we can simply use an AND gate to test for that. So that's everything we need to add 2 bits together, but of course in some of the steps we actually had 3 bits we needed to add together because there was a carry bit from the previous step to deal with. And in fact we could think of these other places as having 0 in the carry spot. So in a way we're always adding 3 bits together. So I'll introduce a third input to the chip over here for the carry input, and we need to add this to the sum of the first 2 bits which we calculated up here. To do that, we can simply use another XOR gate wired up to that carry input and to the sum of the first 2 inputs. So I'll introduce a third input to the chip over here for the carry input, and we need to add this to the sum of the first 2 bits which we calculated up here. To do that, we can simply use another XOR gate wired up to that carry input and to the sum of the first 2 inputs. We'll then need a second AND gate as well, because if the sum of the first 2 bits is 1, and the carry input is 1, then we'll need to carry 1 to the next step. So if either of our 2 AND gates detect that we should be carrying 1, then we'll of course want to output 1 to the carry output, which we can do using an OR gate. Let's check if this is working properly. So with all of the inputs off, or 0, both the sum and the carry output bits should be 0. Then if any single input is 1, the sum should be 1 and the carry should be 0. So far so good. Next, if any 2 inputs are 1, then the sum bit should be 0 and the carry should be 1. And finally, if all 3 inputs should be 0 and the carry should be 1. And finally, if all 3 inputs are 1, then the sum should be 1 and the carry should be 1. And it looks like it's all working, so I'll give it a name, and then what I'd like to do is take this adder we've made and use it to construct a 4-bit adder capable of taking these 2 4-bit numbers that we have as our inputs and calculating the 4-bit sum as the output. I did this displayed, by the way, to tell us what all these values are in decimal, just so it's a bit easier to tell if this thing is working. So we'll need 4 adders to construct this, and I'll wire each one up to the outputs. Then there's a carry input here, just in case we want to string 2 4-bit adders together to make an 8-bit adder, for example. So that can go into the carry input of the first adder, and then its example. So that can go into the carry input of the first adder, and then its carry output goes into the carry input of the next one, and so on down the chain. Finally, I'll need to connect up the two 4-bit inputs. Let's test this out. So right now we have 0 plus 0 equals 0, which is a good sign. Let me try 1 plus 1, 2 is correct, 5 plus 1 is 6, and 7 plus 1 is 8. So it looks like we can add numbers together, which is pretty cool. Of course, with just 4 bits, if we try to 15 plus 1, for example, it will overflow to 0, because we don't have enough bits to store 16, and the carry bit will light up over here, telling us the result was too big for 4 bits. It will light up over here, telling us the result was too big for 4 bits. If we want to extend this to handle subtraction, we'll need a way to represent negative numbers in binary. I always assumed that this last spot was used to indicate the sign of the number. So what we have here would be positive 7, and this would be negative 7. But of course, you'd expect that if we added 7 to negative 7, we'd end up with 0, but that's clearly not the case here. So one way we could try thinking about this is what would we have to add to 7 in order to get 0 as the result? Well, in order to get a 0 in the first spot, this would need to be a 1, because remember, 1 plus 1 gives us a sum bit of 0. Of course, we also now have to carry 1 to the next spot. So now we know that there should be a 0 here, so that we'll again have 1 plus 1 giving us a 0 for our sum bit, and a carry of 1. We can then deduce that there should be a 0 here as well, and we can continue like this to end up with all zeros for our 4 bits. There is a 1 that ends up over here, but since we're working with just 4 bits, that can be discarded. So we figured out that negative 7 must be 1001. That might seem a bit weird, but it actually makes some sense if we think of this last spot as the negative 8 place, because then we could write this out as negative 8 times 1, plus 4 times 0, plus 2 times 0, plus 1 times 1, which gives us negative 7. Let's start at 0 and see what it looks like now if we count up. So 7 is now the largest number we can have with 4 bits, and it then flips over to the smallest number, negative 8. And from there we have negative 7, negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, and finally all ones would be negative 1. So it's a bit of a funky system, but it allows us to add negative and positive numbers together without any fuss. So it's totally worth the weirdness. Now, there's actually a simple two-step procedure for making any positive number negative. Take the number positive 6, for example, 0110 in binary. The first step is to invert all the bits. So where there's a 0, we write a 1, and vice versa, giving us 1001. At this point, if we were to add these two together, we'd obviously get all 1s. We want it to be all 0s though, and we saw a few minutes ago that if we take this and just add 1 to it, we'll end up with 0 for the 4 bits we're interested in. This tells us that clearly our inverted number is just 1 too little to give us all 0s. So the second step, as you might predict, is to take the inverted number and just add 1 to it. So in this case, we take 1001 and add 1, and that would give us 1010. And if we look back at the number wheel, that is indeed negative 6. So, using that 4-bit adder we built, we can of course add these two 4-bit numbers together. But if the subtract signal over here is on, then I want to subtract the second number from the first, which we can do by making the second number negative. And remember, we do that by inverting the bit, which we can do by over here is on. Then I want to subtract the second number from the first, which we can do by making the second number negative. And remember, we do that by inverting the bits and then adding 1. So to invert the bits, we need something that looks at the subtract signal, and if that's off, the input bits should be unchanged.
Нет, не знаю. Нет, народ, нет. Нет. Ну нет, наоборот. Нет. Да нет, не надо.
But if the subtract signal is on, then the bit should be inverted. Conveniently, this table actually matches the exclusive OR we made earlier, so we can just use 4 of those to invert these bits only if the subtract signal is on. The last step of negating a number was to add 1, so we can just feed the subtract signal into the carry input of the adder, and that will do that for us. Alright, I'll quickly go ahead and wire up the rest of the inputs, and then output the results. The result was to add 1 these bits only if the subtract signal is on. The last step of negating a number was to add 1, so we can just feed the subtract signal into the carry input of the adder, and that'll do that for us. Alright, I'll quickly go ahead and wire up the rest of the inputs, and then output the results. I also have these 3 extra outputs, and these are just for flagging some stuff about the results. This one over here, for example, tells us if the result was 0, and we can test for that, like so. This other output tells us if the result was negative, which is true if our negative 8-bit is set to 1. And finally, there's the carry, which I can just take from here. And this is just information that'll be useful to us later on. Let's now test if this is actually doing what we want. 1, set the inputs, then adding 1. So to invert the bits, we need something that looks at the subtract signal, and if that's off, the input bits should be unchanged. But if the subtract signal is on, then the bit should be inverted. Conveniently, this table actually matches the exclusive OR we made earlier, so we can just use 4 of those to invert these bits, only if the subtract signal is on. The last step of negating a number was to add 1, so we can just feed the subtract signal into the carry input of the adder, and that'll do that for us. Alright, I'll quickly go ahead and wire up the rest of the inputs, and then output the results. I also have these 3 extra outputs, and these are just for flagging some stuff about the result. This one over here, for example, tells us if the result was 0, and we can test for that, like so. This other output tells us if the result was negative, which is true if our negative 8-bit is set to 1. And finally, there's the carry, which I can just take from here. And this is just information that will be used to us later on. Let's now test if this is actually doing what we want. So I'll try 3 plus 4, and that's 7, so it looks like we haven't broken addition at least. Now I'll try turning on the subtract signal, so we're doing 3 plus negative 4, which of course is the same as saying 3 minus 4, and the result is indeed negative 1, so that's good. Let me try negative 2 minus 4, and that gives us negative 6. Then let's see if it can handle subtracting a negative number. So I'll try negative 2 minus negative 4. Even that seems to work. We get positive 2. I want to test 1, 4. Even that seems to work. So I'll try negative 2. Then let's see if it can handle subtracting a negative number. So I'll try negative 2 minus negative 4. Even that seems to work. We get positive 2. I want to test one last thing, which is adding 2 negative numbers together. And once again, the math seems to check out. So this is going to be our arithmetic and logic unit. Although, to be honest, it doesn't actually do any logic. There would just be things like doing the AND operation on the inputs and outputting that, for example. But we can expand this later if necessary. For now, I'll call it ALU for short, and package it up into a tiny widget. So that's going to be all for this first episode. I hope you found it interesting. And in the next one, I want to look at how memory works, because I'm very curious to learn more about that. Until then, cheers.
И что, он единственный владеет? Ага, конечно. Я на вторую проверил, машину 3 раза уже продавали. Зачем они так делают, а?
Узнай прошлые машины. Купи отчет про авто на Автору.
Hello and welcome to a new coding adventure. Today I'm going to be simulating a simple ecosystem, an idea which was inspired by this really cool video from the channel Primer. I started by generating a little map with water tiles so that creatures would have something to drink, and land tiles for them to move around on. I also added some trees as decorations and obstacles, and then some little plants as a food source. Next, I needed a creature, so I made a cute little bunny out of some cubes and placed him into the world. He seemed happy enough just hopping around, but of course I wasn't going to let him have such an easy life. I gave him hunger and thirst, so he'll need to find some water soon or else die. Fortunately for him, there's some nearby, so he's hopping over to that and having a drink. There's also a plant over there, so he's going to head over to that and gobble it up. Now he's thirsty again, so back to the water. This, by the way, is his sensory radius, outside of which he's blind. So currently he's just hopping around randomly trying to find some food, but now that he's spotted that plant up there, he's going to head directly over to it. The next thing I added was an urge to reproduce. Currently that urge is stronger than the bunny's hunger or thirst, so he'll go searching for a mate. He's not likely to have much luck though, on account of being the only rabbit in existence. So, I'll add in a female bunny, and let's see if they get together. They're both searching, and it looks like they've spotted one another. You may want to avert your eyes for this. Alright, it's safe to look again. The bunny is now pregnant, so in just a few moments we should be able to welcome some new little creatures to the world. These little fellows will take some time to grow up, during which their speed and sense of sight will develop, so right now they're of course particularly vulnerable. In the simulation, female bunnies actually have a gene which controls how long they're pregnant for. If that duration is short, they can obviously have offspring more frequently, but the offspring will be more underdeveloped and have less of a chance of surviving to adulthood. There are a few more genes, one for sensitive and have less short, they can obviously have offspring more frequently, controls how long they're pregnant for. If that duration is short, they can obviously have a gene which controls how long they're pregnant for. If that duration is short, they can obviously have offspring more frequently, but the offspring will be more underdeveloped and have less of a chance of surviving to adulthood. There are a few more genes, one for sensory distance and one for reproductive urge, which I've described already. Then there's one for speed, allowing the rabbit to move faster at the cost of getting hungry and thirsty more quickly. Finally, for males only, there's desirability, which here is expressed by having redder fur. So looking at the code for a second, here is expressed by having redder fur. So looking at the code for a second, when a male rabbit spots a female who's also looking for a mate, he'll send a signal to her, and the more desirable he is, the higher the chance that she'll accept his advances. If she rejects him, he'll add her to his mental list of unimpressed females, and won't approach her again until he's forgotten about it a little while later. Now, when two rabbits mate, the offspring will inherit these genes from their parents. In the code, you can see that each gene will be randomly selected to come from either the mother or the father. On top of that, there's a small chance for each gene to mutate, which will increase or decrease its value by a little bit. Alright, I'm going to start the simulation out with 300 rabbits, and let's see what happens.
Нет, не надо. Нет, что мне, ну вот нет, наоборот, ну вот надо, есть там сам, ну вот надо. А, ну вот это есть там, да. А, ну да, ну вот нет, наоборот. Нет, наоборот. Нет, наоборот. Ну нет, ну ладно. Ага, ну копии себе же можно наоборот, наоборот. Да. Вот нет, ну вот надо, есть там самое, да. Вот, понятно, что. Нет, это я не знаю. Вот нет, ну вот нет, наоборот. Да. Ну вот надо, да. Да нет, ну надо, ну вот нет. Да, вот нет. Да наоборот, блин. Нормально, значит, блин. Вот нет, наоборот, вот это есть то же самое. Артишок. Не знаю, что делать, надо играть. Я что-то не понимаю. Нет, имел в виду вообще-то. Нет, ну нет, да, наоборот. Ну наоборот, потому что нет. Да наоборот. Да наоборот. Ну нет, ну. Нет. Нет, ну наоборот. Нет. Нет. Ну вот нет, наоборот. На, вот это есть портфолио. А, вот она и говорила, что это. А, ну да. Ну. Нет, надо это кому-то, нет, никому не надо там это делать, ну вот это есть. Надо никому это не надо показывать никому. Наоборот. Ну нет, наоборот. Какими новостями-то, что ты с ума сойдешь уже, с ума сойдешь, нет. Какими новостями, если поделиться надо о себе, ну как бы, ты уходишь отсюда, что ты ушел уже, да. Куда я ушел, наоборот, вот нет. К себе ушел. Каким себе, о чем не говорят, к себе ушел просто и все, да. Да, это нет, я понял. Ну нет. Создание этого.